Cool, awesome, good to be with you. If you got a Bible, go ahead and grab it. We're gonna be in Genesis. We got a lot to cover today, 37 through 50. So that's what, 13 chapters. Math's not my forte, so I think it's 13 chapters, 37 through 50. A lot we got to cover today. So if you got a Bible, meet me there. While you're turning there, you may have heard the name Corrie ten Boom. You've heard that name before? So Corrie ten Boom wrote a book called The Hiding Place. And in that book, she tells the story of her family and all that they went through during the years of the World War II. In fact, her family were Christians in Holland during World War II. And they were known, well, quite frankly, their Christian faith led them to hide Jews away from the Nazis who were invading Holland at the time. And so not only were they helping hide Jews, but they were actually smuggling Jews all across Holland to try to protect them from Nazi invaders, again, as they were invading Holland. Well, at a certain point in their story, they get captured. And when they're captured, they're put into a concentration camp. And so the book is telling the story of that. You've never read the book, you really need to read the book. I think there's even a couple of movies that have been made off of that book. But you need to read that because it tells the story of their life story. And so once they're put into a concentration camp, what happens to them is that all of the family members of all of Corrie's family are killed during that time, except for her. She's the only one that survives the concentration camp. And at the end of it, Corrie is quoted as saying this, that there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. I ran across that this week, and I thought, boy, what a statement. After all that she had been through, all of her circumstances, for even doing the right thing, she says, there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. Man, what a powerful, powerful statement. And you know, as I was reading that this week, I thought, Lord, how in the world can she say that? Have you ever felt like that in life where, man, how in the world could God be good? How in the world can I look back on my circumstances or no matter how hard life has been and think, well, man, how can God be good in this? I just don't understand, right? We've been there. And the story of Joseph is very similar to that. It's a very different story because we all have our own stories. And yet there's some really big similarities to Joseph's story and to Corrie's story. So I want us to try to answer that question. How can God be good even in our suffering? How can God be good as we look at the story of Joseph? So again, we got to cover a lot. So we're going to begin in Genesis 37. And we're going to cover 37 through 50, so you're going to have to run with me here, okay? We got a lot of summarizing to do, a lot of reading to do, but it's going to be fine because we're going to, as Josh said, we're going to do it together. We're going to do it together, and I'm not even making you run through mud and under obstacles. Okay, so here's what we know about Joseph. Joseph is the eldest son of Jacob and Rachel, and we know from a couple of weeks ago that Joseph is the favorite son of all of Jacob's kids. To demonstrate his love, in Genesis 37, Jacob makes him a coat of many colors. You may remember that from a felt board in Sunday school. The coat of many colors. He makes him that, and of course that seems like a really nice gesture. However, it actually stokes the flame between Joseph and his brothers. And to make matters worse, Joseph knows that he's the favorite, and like any little brother would do if he knew that he was the favorite, he lords it over the big brothers. He rubs it in their face. Perhaps this is best demonstrated in the dream that Joseph has. Maybe you remember that dream. One night, Joseph is asleep, and he has this dream that one day his brothers are going to bow down to him. But not only are the brothers going to bow down to him, but so is his dad. Again, like any little brother would do, at the breakfast table, Joseph has an opportunity to bring that up to big brothers. Hey guys, you know what's in your future? I know what's in mine. You're gonna be bowing down to me. Not only that, but so is dad too. You can imagine that probably didn't go very well. Already jealous, now provoked to anger, the brothers decide, you know what? Well, we're going to fix this problem. And you might think, well, maybe we'll pick on him. Maybe we'll bully him a little bit. Oh, no. They decide, well, we're just going to kill him. We'll get rid of the problem. So they set this whole plan up, right? Where Joseph comes out to the field and Joseph is going to check on the brothers, and the brothers devise this plan. They dig a pit, they throw him in the pit, all to ultimately kill him, except for one brother decides, hey, maybe we shouldn't kill him. Right? And so they leave him in this pit. And by the way, if you're reading in the text says that the brothers sat down and had lunch. How wicked. I mean, how you throw your brother to leave him for dead, and then you sit down and eat lunch while he's screaming for his life. You can't put that on a felt board, you know? There's just some things that we missed in Sunday school because you just can't quite show that. Right, well, that's what's happening here. One brother decides, hey, you know what? Let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery because that seems like a better option. So there's a group of Ishmaelites who are coming down the road, and Reuben says, hey, you know what? Those guys, I'm sure they would love to have him. And so they sell him to the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites get to Egypt, and they do what they would normally do, and they put him up for auction, and somebody named Potiphar picks Joseph up in Egypt. And that's where we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 39, verse 2. So Joseph has been sold into slavery not once, but now twice from the Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites sell him to Potiphar. Chapter 39, verse 2, we learn about Potiphar and Potiphar's experience with Joseph. This is pretty great. I want you to see it. This is Potiphar describing Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And so Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And Potiphar made him the overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Now, can you imagine a slave who goes from being a slave, a servant in the house, to now being in charge of all that his master had? That's what's happened here for Joseph. He has been put in all authority over Potiphar, who is one of the right-hand guys to Pharaoh himself. Now, unfortunately, as the story goes, Joseph's success doesn't last long. Potiphar's wife starts to take notice of old Joseph. Maybe he was good looking, I don't know, a strapping young lad, but she takes notice of him. As we learn, she comes on to Joseph multiple times, and he denies her. In fact, one day when Joseph was in the house all alone, she comes on to him, and what does he do? He flees from her. He does exactly what he should do. He runs out the door. But as he does, she grabs a hold of his tunic and pulls it off, and she begins to call out that Joseph tried to take advantage of her. Now, this puts Potiphar in a pretty difficult position, as you can imagine. The person who is in charge of his house has now attempted to abuse and to take his wife. And so Potiphar does, he takes his wife's word, and he ends up putting Joseph in prison. So now Joseph finds himself not only in slavery, but rising to the top all the way to go to the very bottom. He's wrongly convicted, no trial, thrown into prison. But guess what? Genesis 39, verse 21 reminds us that the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him great favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. One of the key themes that you'll see over and over and over again with the story of Joseph is that Joseph never has to do life alone. There's never a moment where Joseph is on his own. There's never a moment where he has been forsaken by the Lord, but rather God is always with him. He never leaves him. He never forsakes him. Time and time again, God remains with Joseph. Now let's keep going. So while Joseph is in prison, Joseph meets a couple of guys. One happens to be a baker and the other a cupbearer for Pharaoh himself. Now, over the course of their friendship and over the course of their relationship, both of these two characters in the story end up having dreams. Not knowing what to do with these dreams. They're pretty wild dreams, so they're like, hey, I need somebody to interpret. Well, they don't have anybody to interpret except for young Joseph. Joseph is sitting there, and for whatever reason, God had gifted him with the ability to interpret dreams. And so they begin to share their dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams. He tells the baker, he said, hey, look, man, I hate to tell you this, but your dream's not a good one. And he says, well, why is my dream not a good one? And Joseph said, well, in a couple of days, they're going to come take you and they're going to kill you. Sorry. Good luck. Hope I'm wrong, but good luck. All right. Well, then the cupbearer shares his dream with Joseph, and Joseph says, hey, this is favorable for you. In fact, in a few days, Pharaoh is going to come get you, and he's going to reinstate you, and you're going to be back in business. And your fate is a whole lot better than your friend, so you might want to say goodbye to your friend because you're not going to see him for very much longer. And so the cupbearer excited about his dream, and the crazy thing is that it comes true. Joseph tells him the dream, and that dream comes true exactly as Joseph said. And as a thanks, on the way out, Joseph says, hey, all I ask, would you just remember me when you get out of prison? When you're reinstated, would you just remember me? And unfortunately, what we learn in chapter 40, verse 23, is that when the cupbearer got out of prison, it says that the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Forgot him. Now keep reading. In Genesis 41, verse 1, here's what we learn. Joseph had been forgotten for 2 whole years. Think about that. His ticket out of prison, where he was wrongfully convicted, no trial. His ticket out of prison was that cupbearer who was reinstated to Pharaoh, and he was forgotten. Not for a day, not for a week, not for a month, not for a year, but for 2 whole years. At this point in Joseph's life, he was left for dead by his brothers, sold into prison, or sold into slavery, wrongfully convicted and thrown into prison. Now, he's forgotten. Talk about an unfortunate series of events. But God didn't forget Joseph. You may be here this morning and you may be struggling with some circumstances, and I don't necessarily know what they are, but I want you to know that God has not forgotten you. There's nothing in your life right now that has caught him off guard. There's nothing that he's surprised by. No job loss, no friendship that's broken and hurting, no abuse, no diagnosis. There's nothing that has caught God off guard in your life. He sees you, he knows you, and he loves you, just like he saw, he knew, and he loved and set his favor on Joseph. Now, 2 years later, Pharaoh has a bizarre dream. What a coincidence. Perplexed by the dream, he goes to everyone that money could buy. He went to magicians, he went to all these different people. Hey, listen, I will pay you whatever you want if you will interpret my dream. And guess what? Nobody could do it. Nobody could do it. And then there's this one day where the cupbearer and Pharaoh are having a conversation. He's stressed out because he can't figure out somebody to interpret this doggone dream. Why can't I figure out what this means? It's perplexing to him. It's keeping him up at night. And then the cupbearer says, wait, I know a guy. And he says, hey, when I was in prison, you remember when you threw me in prison, Pharaoh? You remember that time? He said, when I was there, I had this crazy dream, and there was this guy, and he was able to interpret the dream, and it came true. And he said, so hey, well, maybe he'll do it for you also. And so he calls for Joseph, and Joseph cleans himself up a bit. They let him take a shower, he shaves, and here he comes down the aisle to meet Pharaoh to interpret this particular dream. So Pharaoh stands before Joseph, and here they have this interaction, and he says, "Can you interpret my dream?" And then notice, and I think it's chapter 41, verse 16, this is how Joseph responds back to Pharaoh. Pretty incredible. Joseph answered Pharaoh. He says, "Well, Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Notice there that Joseph recognizes the favor of the Lord, that it's not in him. He doesn't get the credit. He gives God the glory. He gives God the credit. Hey, it's not in me that's going to give you a favorable answer. It's going to be the Lord, Yahweh, the only one true God who is going to give you an answer. Now, after interpreting the dream, Pharaoh sets his favor on Joseph. In Genesis 41, 37 through 40, here's what the text tells us. Pharaoh says to his servants of Joseph, he says, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are." Wow, that's a big statement, I would think. "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." At the age of 30, notice that, at the young age of 30, Joseph became the most powerful man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. The favor of the Lord, it's really hard to put the favor of the Lord on a resume. God doesn't need our resume to establish his authority in our life and his favor over our lives. When God has a plan, there's nothing that will thwart it, age included. And so God sets his favor on him in that moment. And he now arises to power, second only to Pharaoh, a slave, a prisoner, now turned most powerful man in all of the land. Only God can do that. Now in verse 57, the text tells us that all of the earth came to Egypt to see Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was so severe over all of the earth. Now, here's what happens there in that particular verse. That's gonna set us up for the climax of the story. You probably read this story. You may know where I'm heading here, but it sets us up for the climax. See, a harsh famine had struck the land, and everyone was without food and water. But because of God's wisdom given to Joseph, which, by the way, that was the whole point of the dream, is that the dream was that there was going to be this harsh famine. And because Joseph was able to interpret the dream, Egypt was able to prepare for the harsh famine because they had 7 years of plenty, so that over the 7 years of famine, they would be ready and they would be prepared, because God prepares his people. And because God prepares his people, he prepares Egypt through the wisdom given to Joseph. Now the people could come to Egypt and purchase food and supplies for their families, and Egypt becomes the hub of redemption or of salvation, so to speak. Now insert the climax of the story. Jacob and his family are caught right in the middle of the famine. And so Jacob, like any good dad, rallies the troops and says, "Hey, listen, we've got to do something if we're going to survive, right? So what are we going to do?" So he devises this plan to send his sons to Egypt. And so he looks at the boys and he says, "Hey, listen, here's what we need to do. I need you guys to go to Egypt. I need you to go there and buy food, supplies, and I need you to bring it back so that we can survive." Man, how the plot thickens. I mean, think about that, right? Because once they arrive in Egypt, guess who holds their survival in his hands? Yeah. All right, little brothers, little sisters in the room, how would you handle this moment? Joseph, the brother that they sold into slavery, left for dead, is now in control of their lives. So as they enter Egypt, they meet with Joseph. Of course, they don't recognize him. And the brothers and Joseph have this kind of really weird, strange series of interactions, right? The brothers come and Joseph kind of plays them on a little bit, and he sends them back to the father. And there's all these weird interactions where we get to the point in the story where Joseph is going to finally reveal himself to the brothers. And you'll see that in Genesis chapter 45, verse 1. So in chapter 45, this is the moment that the story is kind of building up to, where Joseph is finally going to reveal himself to his brothers. And here's what happens in verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all of those who stood by him. He cried out, "Make everyone go out from me," speaking of his counsel. And so no one stayed with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And Joseph wept aloud. So loud was his weeping that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph, don't you know?" And he asked them a great question that was near and dear to his heart, as, "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. I looked up what dismayed meant. I felt like that leaves it a little short for what those brothers probably felt. It was shocked, amazed, how do we get out of here right now kind of moment, right? I mean, you gotta be kidding me. How can you be Joseph? And yet here, Joseph is standing before his brothers. I can't even imagine the emotion in that meeting. I mean, think about it this way. Joseph feeling the weight of all of the anger, the bitterness, all of the things as he looks back on the story of his life. Everything was great for Joseph. Remember, he has the vision, you guys are gonna be bowing down to me. And then from that moment on, he's thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, thrown into prison. All because these knuckleheads were jealous of him. I can't even imagine the anger, bitterness, and the frustration that he must have harbored. And then the brothers, as they stand before what had to seem like a ghost. I mean, this is the one that they sold into slavery, left for dead. Man, what are we gonna do now? I mean, there's no way that he's gonna let us survive. How are we gonna explain this to dad if he lets us get back to dad? And yet, look at how Joseph responds in chapter 45, verse 4. Instead of revenge, look at this. This is wild. I can't conceptualize this. So Joseph, he says to his brothers, "Hey, come near to me, please. Come here, come. So they came near. And here's what he said. He says, "I am your brother Joseph." Notice he doesn't let them get away with it. "Whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Underline this. "For God sent me before you to preserve life." It wasn't the brothers that sent him to Egypt. It was God who sent him to Egypt. Even in our suffering, God has a plan. Even in our suffering, God is working behind the scenes. Oh, keep reading. Verse 7. "God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but it was God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord over all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Who's doing the action in Joseph's description of his life? It's God. God is doing it. Well, soon thereafter, Joseph, he forgives his brothers. He's going to send for his father, right? I mean, there's something near and dear to Joseph's heart, and that is, I want to be reunited to my father. So he sends the brothers. He says, hey, I want you to go. I want you to get my father, and I want you to bring him here. And so they do that. And Joseph and Jacob have this beautiful opportunity to reunite after 17 or so years of believing that his son was dead. Now Joseph and Jacob reunite, and he gets to spend 17 of his last years knowing that his son, his favorite son, is alive. And that leads us to Jacob's passing. So Jacob will eventually die in Egypt, and his brothers, of course, begin to get a little bit nervous. Right? Dad's now dead. Dad's not here to protect us. So now what? Now what's going to happen? And so they begin to get anxious and nervous about, well, now that Dad's gone, is Joseph going to, is he going to drop the hammer now? I mean, is this the moment when he takes revenge? Is this it? Was he just being nice and forgiving for Dad? Is that why he was doing all of that? You can imagine the intensity of the season of their life as their father passes away. And yet, again, Genesis 50, verse 19, Joseph puts an end to all of their worry. He says, do not fear. Oh man, it's so good. Joseph says, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. You know, there is so much to say about this story. We could spend hours upon hours upon hours unpacking all of the different applications to this story. I mean, it is one, if not the most amazing stories in all of the Bibles, and perhaps has the best ending. But among many of those things, one of the most incredible aspects of this story is that God used Joseph in his difficult story to preserve a people on earth. But there's more than that. Certainly not less than that, but there's also more than that. See, God used Joseph's story not only to save a remnant on earth, but also to preserve the line by which the Messiah would come. I want you to think about this, right? The story of Joseph is the story of God's faithfulness to bring about his promise on earth to offer an offspring who would one day make all things right. All sad things will eventually come untrue because God sent Joseph to Egypt to preserve a line, a remnant of which the Messiah would come to this earth and to make all things right. If the famine doesn't end with the people of Israel, with Jacob and his sons, with Israel and his 12 sons, the promise dies with them. But God, in his divine wisdom, used the story of Joseph to send him to Egypt to preserve a people, but much more than that, to preserve a salvation that you and I can sit in this room today, saved, name written in the Lamb's book of life because of Joseph's story. So don't tell me that your story doesn't matter. God is using even your story this morning. Now, he may not be using your story to preserve a remnant on earth or to preserve the messianic line, but he is using your story in a powerful, supernatural, divine way. See, every one of us has a unique story that God is writing in your life. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that you and I are the salt and light of the earth. He doesn't tell us to be salt and light. He says that by nature of you accepting me and my spirit living within you, you now are salt and light. That means as salt, you are a life preserver on this earth. That means that while you live here in Belton, Texas, in 2024, you are salt. That means that you are preserving life by the way that you speak to people, by the way that you love people, by the way that you bless people. And so when people come into your home, they ought to experience a preservation of life. When they interact with you at work, they ought to experience life. You ought to fill them, encourage them, challenge them, push them to more of God, make them better. And shame on you, shame on me, and shame on Christians if we are not preserving life on the earth. There are far too many Christians who are critical, who are unhelpful, not encouraging, and who lack so much faith, and they're so insecure because they don't recognize that they are in the righteousness of Christ and their identity is in Him and not in the things of this earth, that they don't preserve life, but they're robbing it. And you're killing the witness. We are preservers of life on this earth. Your story matters, and the way that you treat people matter. The way that we interact with people on this earth matters. The whole law is bound up in this, to love God and to love people as ourselves. So we are preservers of life, but we are also light. We are light. We live in a world of darkness. And for light to be light, it has to live in darkness. If it didn't live in darkness, it wouldn't be light. There would be no value for light, right? And so you and I are surrounded by darkness. And so we stand up as light, right? We offer people a way to salvation. We offer them a way back to their Creator. We offer them hope. It's like someone lost at sea in a lighthouse being the thing that directs them towards hope, safety, and security. That is what you are. In your home, in your workplace, on the ball field. I probably need to confess that I didn't do that very well on the ball field yesterday, but we're working that out. But we are light. That is who we are. That is who you are. Your story matters. Now, Genesis 50:25, here's how the story of, this is how Joseph's story concludes. It's really powerful. The end of his life, this is what it reads in verse 25. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Kind of a weird way to end your life, but it's really powerful. Hebrews 11, verse 22 gives us some context. By faith, it says, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites, and he gave direction concerning his bones. This is not as weird as you might think it to be, because what it is it is a demonstration of Joseph's faith. He gives a final prophecy of the Exodus. He says, hey, listen, God's not done. His story is not finished with you. He's gonna take you from here and he's gonna take you into the promised land. And so when you leave here, take me with you. Take me with you. See, what Joseph recognized is that Egypt was not his home. While he had experienced a great deal of success and favor of the Lord in Egypt, he was second in command only to Pharaoh himself, had tons of riches, had all of the things and the comforts of life. He recognized that this was not his home, but that God had more in store for him, and it wasn't gonna be in Egypt, but it was gonna be in the promised land. And so he says, hey, listen, you take me home. You take me to the promised land. You take me to the promise of God, because he is faithful. He is faithful. Joseph's faith, after all he had experienced, both good and bad, was the conviction that God was gonna fulfill his promise by bringing his people into the land. And he said, so do not leave me here, but take me there. Take me to Jesus. Wow. Now, here are 4 things that I've jotted down this week that I'm thinking through. And I want to share them with you. It's going to be real quick because we're going to run through these. So I just want you to write them down, and I want you to chew on them through the week. Number 1, I want you to think about it this way. Faith, when we're talking about faith, faith produces patience through unjust treatment. Maybe you're sitting here this morning and somebody has treated you poorly, maybe unjustly so. By your faith in Christ, you know that God is the justifier of all wrong things. Like Joseph, am I in the place of God? No, God is God, I am not. And so he trusted God to handle his unjust treatment. See, our faith allows us to be patient through unjust treatments. But also, number two, faith yields steadfastness during temptation. Listen, Joseph was thrown into prison for something that he did not do. As the saying goes, right? No good deed goes unpunished. Joseph was punished for doing the right thing. Now, you've probably heard this phrase, no good deed goes unpunished, but in God's economy, his favor rests on those who live a righteous life. God never left Joseph. He walked right through every single trial and temptation with him. We do not have a great high priest who cannot relate to us and what we go through, but rather he goes through it with us. It helps us in steadfastness through temptation. The third thing is that faith extends forgiveness undeserved. Listen, if you're anything like me, if you're in Joseph's place, you're about to lay the hammer on those brothers. And yet, Joseph doesn't. He extends forgiveness undeserved. Listen, if you're harboring anger and you're refusing to forgive somebody, it's because you don't recognize the forgiveness that's been extended to you. The only reason why you and I can't forgive, if Joseph can forgive, you can forgive, right? The only way you and I don't forgive somebody is because you do not recognize the forgiveness that has been given to you. Faith extends forgiveness undeserved. And then fourth, faith transforms your perspective on life. The only way it makes sense, the only way that it makes sense that Joseph could come to his life and forgive his brothers and all of those things is if he recognized the magnitude of God in his life. It was God who sent me here, not you. It was God who's in control of my life. It was God who's writing my story. And while it wasn't pretty, while it wasn't pleasant, God was writing my story for a purpose. He had that kind of perspective. It's an eternal perspective on his life. And so here, back to the question, how can Joseph, how can people like Corrie ten Boom, how can they have so much hope and forgiveness in a life of tragedy and suffering? How can they do that? Well, I think it has to do with their faith in God and their perspective in life. There's one thing that I want you to remember about God. No matter what we face in this life, God is working it out for our good and the good of others, somehow, some way. That doesn't mean you'll be able to see it. It doesn't mean you can explain it. But nevertheless, it doesn't make it any less true. One day, you and I will all be able to look back and you'll be able to see God's hand writing your story all along. And Lord willing, we will be able to say, there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. Will you pray with me? Well, God, we come to you today and we want to be able to say that phrase, that there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. And so, Lord, help us to have that kind of perspective on life, that no matter what it is that we go through, no matter what kind of suffering it may be, there is no pit that we find ourselves that you are not deeper still, that you are not in the pit with us, pulling us up out of the pit, focusing our eyes on Jesus, knowing that we can have hope because we have Jesus. Father, we thank you for him. It's in the powerful name of Jesus that we pray. Amen.